you for joining our first virtual Holding Court series in the new year, featuring leading advocates, attorneys, and elected officials to discuss issues related to our courts, our rights, and our judiciary. We are so honored tonight to be joined by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator from Rhode Island, who is a forceful and courageous champion for our courts. One of the clearest, strongest voices sounding the alarm about the right's decades-long campaign to take over the courts. Senator Whitehouse recently released a series of white papers cataloging the impact of their court capture on workers, the environment, consumers, civil rights, democracy, and the rights of all of us. He is a true champion of the Judiciary Committee, making headlines for so skillfully questioning Trump's judges. And well before taking them on, he fought to get Obama's nominees confirmed. And we're thrilled to be working with him and his wonderful staff to confirm President Biden's judges. I'm also excited to be joined by my colleague, Tom Saenz, President and General Counsel of MALDEF, and our moderator, Jen Bendery. Now, I've known Tom for, I think, several decades, and I so admire his passion, his brilliant litigation skills, and his wonderful leadership style. It's a treat, Tom, to have you join us. And Jen is known by all of you, I'm sure, a senior politics reporter for Huffington Post. She's covered Congress and the White House since April of 2011. She previously reported on Congress for 4 years for Roll Call, a Capitol Hill newspaper, and spent 4 years covering the Texas legislature for Gallery Watch in Austin, Texas. Tonight, we're gathering under different circumstances from the last time we were together. We're entering a new era in democracy with a Democratic majority in the Senate and a Democrat in the White House. We can transform the judiciary. We're excited to see Senate Democrats expeditiously, or will be excited, confirm a host of qualified, diverse judges from all corners of the legal profession. We're excited to be working alongside Majority Leader Schumer and the new class of senators to make an unprecedented push to reshape our courts. We're gearing up to work closely with him and the rest of the Senate to nominate and confirm judges who will secure equal rights and human rights. It's time for Democrats and the Biden administration to make nominating and confirming judges an absolute priority. We have the opportunity now to work swiftly and decisively, and we expect Senate Democrats to recognize the urgency of this moment. And with that, and with this wonderful era upon us, I will turn this over to Jen Bendery. One other point, we will have this conversation for about 45 minutes and then open it up for questions. You may submit questions throughout the program by emailing rachel@afj.org. And with that, I'm turning this over to Jen Bendery. Welcome, Jen.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Nice to be here on a virtual panel at home. My first question I want to ask you, Senator Whitehouse. In recent years, you've become very vocal about corporate interests trying to influence the courts to achieve what they can't in Congress. Your remarks during Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation hearing actually went viral, which is very exciting for judicial nominations reporters. Your remarks went viral because you very expertly laid out the connections between dark money, the Federalist Society, and the Judicial Crisis Network, and how they've been fueling a pretty massively funded conservative campaign to seat Supreme Court justices and appeals court judges. So here we are now in the post-Trump era, about a week in, And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think it's critical for progressives to make a big push on prioritizing the nomination and confirmation of judges, and why right in this moment, why this is actually a really good time to go.
Sure. But first I have to exercise my prerogatives to congratulate Nan, and I know that she's preparing to step down, and she's been one of my heroes and founded this organization, has been at it for over 40 years. And so up in Boston, when there's a big heroic sports figure, they take his jersey and hoist it up and hang it in the rafters. And your jersey is going to be in the rafters of AFJ forever. So let me just start with that, because this is a special moment. Yeah, we've got a lot we can do. For starters, we have got a pretty good record of Republican support for needing more judges in a variety of areas. Not the Supreme Court judges that they're berserk about, but district judges and maybe even circuit judges. So in addition to waiting for the vacancies and filling them rapidly and effectively, we also need to push to create more judges in the districts where that is justified. And the reason that we have to do that is because there has been a very sophisticated effort to basically pack the courts with people who are less interested in being judges and administering fair and equal justice than they are in being the clarions of a right-wing movement and the stooges of the corporate interests behind that right-wing movement. And I think it's not enough that we try to dilute that with more and better judges. We also have to make sure we really drill down and look into not only the phenomenon of those judges coming on board, but the machinery that was set up over years to make that happen. It took a lot of construction and a lot of effort to build the assembly line that Mitch McConnell ran. And so we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we can be really positive about our chances right now.
So what do you make of just looking at the last 4 years as a Democratic senator who's made, the courts and judges a priority? What would you say if someone just woke up from a coma from the last 4 years and they were like, oh, well, what's happened with the courts? How are they different now because of the Trump administration and Mitch McConnell? What is your take as one senator who is in the thick of it all? Like, how do our courts look different?
You're not going to believe it. We have had corruption in plain view. But because the big money funders who are behind the Mitch McConnell assembly line are also the big money funders behind the Republican Party, and particularly behind Mitch McConnell, there has been a complete partisan, I should say, disinterest in asking really obvious questions. If you take the identities out of this, take the partisanship out of it, take the names out of it, and just go to the general question of, when you are appointing judges in country X, should you allow private organization Y to take over the judicial selection process while it is receiving unlimited secret donations from big corporate interests? And anybody in their right mind would answer the question, no, that's a truly horrible way to select judges and is a brightly lit avenue for corruption. And yet that's exactly what they did. And they all studiously pretend that there's nothing wrong with that obvious defect because they can't criticize it, because the same people who set up that process are their political overseers. I mean, it's just a rotten state of affairs.
Do you think that, something I've wondered a lot as I've covered this is, it certainly seems to me that Mitch McConnell, for one, did not personally agree with Donald Trump on just about anything. And my sense is he wasn't a big fan of him personally either. And yet they worked hand in hand to get the courts filled up. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think people just used Trump to do what they wanted and didn't really care
Totally.
what else he did?
I mean, in some respects, he was like the most ineffectual person in the world until his empty glove was filled with whatever hand had bought their way into being able to use the government glove to its benefit. So you had, fossil fuel stooges like Scott Pruitt running the EPA, and you had the judicial selection effort insourced, to use his legal counsel's word, from the Federalist Society, which in turn had its own internal little scheme to do the judicial selection. So I think if you look at a lot of the behavior here, it looks a little hard to understand unless you apply to it the theory that there are really significant donor interests, big funders who are hiding behind all these dark money schemes, and they're funding a variety of different operations. And one of the ones that they're funding is Mitch McConnell's political operation. So when they come to Mitch and say, we want to make sure you drive all these judges through that we've selected through this other dark money funded judicial selection operation that we have built, he's not really in a position to say no or to quarrel with them. He's in the position he's in because he's been able to deploy huge dark money political artillery in Senate races to keep his position. Remember when we had Bai and Feingold and what's his name, the former Strickland, and they were all supposed to win their Senate seats, and they all had big near, double-digit leads, and then the artillery started falling on them more than a year before the election, while it's like strafing airplanes on the runway, and they never really got their candidacies off the ground. And by the time the race was really on, all three of those supposed to win Democratic races, we'd abandoned because the numbers had gone so badly the other way. Who put in those tens of millions of dollars that early to blow up these candidates and cement Mitch's return to power? Gee, I wonder. Same guy, same people behind the Judicial Crisis Network, same people behind the FedSoc selection operation. And I think we need to dig in and prove that.
So, okay, so then looking ahead now, we've got Biden in the White House, and
Yep.
People who care about the courts are watching him now to see, okay, let's go. We're ready for progressive judges. There's some vacancies open. They've certainly signaled from the White House team that they're making this a priority, that they care about diversity. They've already reached out to Democratic senators like you and urged you guys to send recommendations ASAP for judicial nominees. But one thing that I remember with Obama, he took some heat for not making judges a bigger priority, at least early on. He didn't make much of a push on it compared to Trump and McConnell working together on that. And like Obama, Biden is coming into office now with some pretty extraordinary challenges in front of him. So my question for you is, do you think that Biden will be different from Obama in the sense of being able to make this a priority now? Particularly given all the things. I mean, he's got a pretty unique set of crises on his hands, but at the same time,
the people who are going to solve COVID for him and the people who are going to get the COVID bill and his big Build Back Better bill through and who are going to work on climate change aren't the same people who are going to oversee the nomination of judges. He has a lot of people working for him, and there are really no excuses about not having the people who are working in the judge appointing world to get going. And I think one of the tests is going to be in the places in which there is not a Democratic senator, or in which there has been a tradition of blue slipping district judges, how tough we're prepared to be about not accepting bad faith failures to return a blue slip, and just driving the nominees through. So, it's on us to do our job. It's on them to do their job, but there really ought to be no excuses. This is not like, designing a fusion reactor or building a battleship. This is pretty simple stuff. This is making sure your shoelaces aren't tied together before you run the race. And unfortunately, we've often started races with our shoelaces tied together.
So I'm glad you mentioned blue slips, because Senator Durbin is about to become the chairman of the Judiciary Committee. So it falls on him to decide if Democrats are going to honor blue slips, which, as anyone knows who's followed this, that Republicans decided to stop using for circuit court nominees.
Yeah.
Do you know, or do you have thoughts on Durbin honoring blue slips? Because I know that's been something he has not really talked about.
My recommendation is that he should honor Democrat blue slips for a circuit court, because that's been our tradition. And I think it's valuable and useful and an important part of being a senator to have a voice in who your nominees are in those seats that are associated with a particular state on a circuit court of appeals, as long as we're not dawdling and, being unhelpful. But the Republicans, as far as I'm concerned, have utterly waived their rights to have any claim to a blue slip for a circuit court. So I wouldn't pay any attention to them. And in more obnoxious cases, I'd make sure that it wasn't even somebody from the home state.
So if it were you, are you saying that you've recommended to Senator Durbin as chairman that he not recognize blue slips for
internal conversations, but if I'm willing to say it here, I think it's pretty well known.
Okay, so to be clear, you're saying that do you know if Durbin is prepared to withhold them, or this is just something that prepared not to honor them, or is this just something that you're saying you've recommended?
I'm not sure any final decision has been made by the chairman. I've just told you what my position is. I think it's also the very logical position.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we go back to giving Republican senators circuit court blue slips, progressive heads are going to explode all across the country by the tens of thousands.
I mean, Leahy did it.
Yeah, but he hadn't lived through the experience of the blue slip being blown up wholesale by the Republicans.
True. Okay, so also looking more broadly from the Judiciary Committee, progressives, it certainly seems to me, have become more excited and engaged in the idea of affecting courts, which is relatively new. The Supreme Court nomination fights tend to get more press than the lower courts, but there does seem to be a bit of a progressive movement now actively engaged in the influence of courts and the rights of people's lives and how to influence judges. I'm curious how you've witnessed the progressive energy change around this issue, because as one reporter covering this, I don't remember much of any energy around this, and Democrats routinely being basically not good at messaging on this, not good at exciting people, not good at just making court issues and judge issues as compelling as some of the more sexy headline issues. And I'm wondering what you make of the energy you've seen around this change, and how do you think maybe you can channel that energy into Democrats being more active in the Senate?
Well, we're still not all that great at it, so I don't want to do too much back patting.
You're not.
But the realization among progressives that the Republicans have stolen a march on us and stolen a bunch of courts and court seats in doing so, and have packed the courts in ways that will have enormous political consequences, I think is increasingly widespread. It's all occurred in the time that I've been on the Senate. I mean, other than AFJ and a few other small groups, if you went to talk to really significant progressive groups with a very significant agenda that the courts were busily harpooning about the problem on the courts, they looked at you like you had two heads and they didn't understand the problem. And it was almost impossible to herd the cats into any kind of coordinated effort on this. So it's really taken, kind of being robbed in the light of day of the last 3 Supreme Court seats to get this onto our radar. Now that it's on, I think we've really learned an important lesson, and now we have to learn our own lesson of how to operationalize that progressive sentiment and make sure that it is effective. And in my view, that means really working hard to expose the dark money machinery through which the Republicans packed the court and pushed Republican senators to violate essentially every rule, norm, and tradition of the Senate to cram these people through. I look at Becerra as a bit of a bellwether. That's the case coming up on dark money. And virtually nobody on our side is paying attention to that case. But it's the case that in which the dark money groups will take the court that dark money built and bootstrap that court to create a constitutional right to dark money. And if we let them get away with that, then we've got a real problem on our hands. But that is clearly their intention. And the big dark money groups like the Chamber and Marathon Petroleum are already asserting a constitutional right to dark money and refusing to answer our questions. It's not pleading the fifth, it's pleading the first. Sir, we respectfully decline to answer your question on grounds that it might tend to violate our right of association. So we know what they're headed for, and our distant early warning systems on all of this are not as good as they could be. So the progressive ire is there, but our operationalizing of it into being really effective representatives of the progressive community has not come to pass fully.
Is this something that you've talked to Senator Schumer about, or in leadership, and said, hey, we need to be making this a much bigger priority, and I'm like over here like a squeaky wheel, and
yep,
this is a big deal? And are they responsive? Or are they like, yeah, like, okay?
Yep, no, they've been really responsive. I mean, if you look at those reports that we did on dark money and court capture, there were 7 of them, and they all ended up actually getting put out through the official channels of the Democratic caucus of the Senate. The DPCC gave them its stamp and its approval. Schumer turned up at the press conferences for it. So we were able to turn this into a caucus-wide issue. And while a lot of our members didn't want to sign the reports because they're pretty harsh stuff, nobody said, no, you shouldn't do that. There was no objection. There was no, backlash.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to interject for a minute. 35 groups have come together for the past 7 months under Building the Bench program, and collected many, many names of candidates,
yep,
really who come from all corners of the legal profession: public defenders, civil rights lawyers, public and environmental lawyers, Native American lawyers. It's a wonderful grouping. And it was rare during the Obama years to see a ACLU lawyer or a lawyer from NAACP able to be confirmed easily. So as a result, we saw lots of corporate lawyers, many prosecutors. I think, don't you, that this offers an opportunity for the Democrats on the committee to talk about the records, to talk about why these particular lawyers with these particular records are so important to showcasing a different way of looking at the courts and access to justice and civil rights. Now's really a chance to go full steam ahead. And
yeah. Well, Nan, you remember the wars we had over my Rhode Island
yes, I do.
District court nominee,
It was
who
McConnell.
was, horror of horrors, a plaintiff's lawyer.
Right.
And who, worse than being a plaintiff's lawyer, is a plaintiff's lawyer who sued big corporations. And worse than that, was one who worked with attorneys general to try to make sure there was maximum leverage on the misbehaving corporations. So the Chamber of Commerce went truly berserk. They made it a scored vote. They sent lobbyists into the Republican lunch to drum up antagonism towards this guy. He's a district court judge. And it's not like every other judge that customarily defends corporations is accused of having impossible bias. It's only when you sue corporations that suddenly you're accused of having an impossible bias. So yeah, we've lived that, and it's really important that we reset it so that the aperture of eligible lawyers is based on quality and not being just a former AUSA or a corporate firm partner.
So one thing I'd like to hear all of you weigh in on is this talk about diversity of judges, because Obama, made a lot of, he made history with a lot of his judges, in terms of historic LGBTQ judges or historic judges of color or different backgrounds. But one thing that even he didn't really do was get into professional diversity. And that's become a thing now that is getting more attention. That is, I've seen more pressure on Biden to really focus on that, because that's a kind of a glaring hole if we're talking about diversity of judges. So I'm wondering if Tom or Nan or Senator Whitehouse, can you guys talk a little bit about why it's been so hard to get that kind of diversity on the bench, even under Obama, and now why that matters? Maybe even especially now, why that matters to have that?
I've done all the talking so far, so I'm going to let Tom.
That was my way to open this up.
Thank you.
You take it away.
So I think we need courage. I think the senator's comments today demonstrate great courage. We need more of that throughout the 50 Democratic members of the Senate, and we need it in the administration. So you asked, Jen, what it is that prevented that kind of professional diversity. It's not wanting to take on the kind of fight that the senator just described with that district court nominee, wanting to avoid those fights. We can't do that anymore. We've got to recognize the importance of that kind of diversity. But I do want to pause, Jen, to say, even with respect to other kinds of diversity, the Obama administration did not achieve what it needed to. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. And it goes back to something that Senator Whitehouse mentioned. Allowing blue slips on Court of Appeals nominees meant that the Obama administration basically was unable to put anyone on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, as a result of that and longstanding issues, is basically a cesspool of extremism. I don't use those terms usually to describe a judiciary or a part of it, but it's a cesspool. And it's a cesspool because we couldn't get anybody who would pass muster with Cornyn and Cruz. So I can't imagine that we should allow someone like Ted Cruz, given his role with what occurred on January 6th, to have some sort of blue slip veto on getting people onto the Fifth Circuit. We can't allow it. The fact is that today there's not a single Latino or Latina judge active on the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is a circuit that has only 3 states that are a part of it, and the dominant state is Texas, which has a 40% Latino population. Because Donald Trump did not put any Latinos on that court, he removed the one remaining active judge by giving that judge an appointment to an ambassadorship. We have no active Latino judges in the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. That can't continue, and it will continue if we allow Ted Cruz to have a veto over who gets put onto the Fifth Circuit. So we still have achievements to make on the issues of racial diversity and the like, despite the progress that was made under Obama. We've gone backwards. Donald Trump appointed exactly 0 African Americans to any court of appeals in the country. He appointed only 1 Latina to any court of appeals in the country, to the 11th Circuit. So we have lots of work just to do on that in that regard. But one last example of the importance of professional diversity, when I agreed to do this panel, which I was happy to, I didn't know that we'd have an example in our headlines today of this exact issue. When someone like Drew Tipton in Texas, a Trump appointee, can issue a nationwide temporary restraining order preventing the new president from pursuing his moratorium, his very well thought out moratorium on deportations removals. When a judge who is as woefully uninformed and frankly uneducated in this area as Judge Tipton can do that, it's Exhibit A for why we need no more professional diversity. His decision betrays not only ideological bias, it betrays a misunderstanding of court procedure and the clear indication from a conservative Supreme Court that nationwide TROs are disfavored in the extreme. But it also reflects a complete misunderstanding of immigration law. Now, no question, immigration law is one of our most complicated federal areas of law, probably only matched by taxation. But we need to get judges whose professional backgrounds have experience in areas like immigration, which is solely a matter of federal law, so that they're in the conversations at judicial conferences. They're in the conversations over lunch with their colleagues. Now, it's another issue that Tipton's down there in a division that's very insular. I think it's him and a senior judge who's the judge he clerked for. That's not a good thing, but that's a separate issue. But we need to have diversity so that when judges are talking amongst themselves, they at least get an informed perspective on things like immigration law, so that what happened yesterday with Judge Tipton won't recur. So I think we have a lot to do when it comes to diversity, and it starts with making sure we don't continue to provide veto power to senators who frankly don't deserve it based on past activities in this arena and in others.
So between the three of you, do you think that it's time to, I mean, especially after the last 4 years and the various rules that Senate Republicans have tossed aside and ignored when it benefited them, is it time to just do away with blue slips?
There was kind of an informal understanding with Senator Graham when he was chair of judiciary that he would protect district court blue slips, which I think is valuable, with the caveat, with the asterisk, that if they felt that your use of the blue slip was obstructive and that you weren't working with the Trump administration to get a suitable judge through, they were prepared then to blow through the blue slip. So I think the Republicans should be held to the same standard. If it appears that they're working in good faith with the Biden administration, if they have produced recommendations to the Biden administration that are, mainstream, acceptable, legitimate district court judges, then I think it's part of the comity of the body to allow that to take place. But if it looks like what we saw in the Obama administration, particularly in the Fifth Circuit, that district judges were being just stalled wholesale. I mean, we had senators talking about judicial emergencies at the same time that they weren't opening seats. They were blue slipping seats closed. So we can't let that happen again. And I think that's the way through it, is you say, look, as long as the chair thinks you're operating in good faith, you have your blue slip. As soon as we think this is just being obstructive, then that's not going to happen. And that's consistent with Senate precedent in a variety of areas where, you get to go and say what you want and do what you want until it looks like you're being dilatory. And if you're being dilatory, then you have to shut up and stop doing whatever you're otherwise entitled to do. And I think that standard can be readily grafted onto district courts. And as to circuits, I fully agree with Tom. They've waived any right to ever exercise blue slips again over their circuit judges. And I wouldn't feel I was limited to the pool in the particular state. If you're Ted Cruz and you've participated in blowing up blue slips and a seat opens up that is pertinent to Texas, you've also waived your claim to have that be a Texas judge from Texas. So bring them down from Brooklyn. I think that you can really open the field then to having really talented people fill in, particularly if you get into areas, like Idaho or, where there may not be a huge pool. I think, they waived that right. And we warned them at the time. So they've got no standing to come back and say, oops, we didn't know that.
So if I can just add, I think what always differentiated circuit appointments from district court appointments was obviously the power of these judges, that they serve multiple states. And that's a reason to treat them differently, always was. But I think I would add to that that really there have been ideologically driven appointments to courts of appeals going back decades. That's how the Fifth Circuit ends up being a cesspool, frankly. So they were always a bit different. And I agree with everything Senator Whitehouse has said about making sure there's a no obstruction rule with respect to district court blue slips. They are different because they're coming from that specific state represented by the senator. Obstruction certainly should be a disqualifier. But the only thing that gives me pause is that what we've seen under the Trump administration, I think, and I'd love to hear Nan's perspective, but more so than in the past, is we're now seeing more ideological appointments to the district courts. I mean, we saw judges who had no business sitting on any court anywhere and who were being put up despite their lack of experience and knowledge just because of their ideology. And that was far, far less frequent at the district court level under prior administrations. Again, you saw that at the circuit court level going back decades. But I think that what has changed under Trump is ideological appointments to the district court. And that's something we really have to review and look at as it relates to blue slips, even at that level, in my view.
So I would just add, I hope many of those judges get bored on those district courts and decide, I'm really not able to promote my agenda the way I thought I would. But the only thing I would add to that, another change, and that is over the years, I have seen recently just a huge amount of enthusiasm among progressives around the courts. It was incredible to see tens of thousands of school teachers rise up against Stephen Menashe's nomination to the Second Circuit. He had been Betsy DeVos's right-hand man. And really in dozens of fights, lower court fights, which is rare, you always have a huge amount of energy around a Supreme Court candidate, but I've never seen so much activism, energy, so many people galvanized around Court of Appeals judges. And all I can say is, Senator Whitehouse, we will be the wind at your back if you want to do away with those blue slips because of recalcitrant senators. We'll be right there.
Jen, I would just add, drawing together what we've talked about, there is a form of obstruction that I hope will be a part of a no obstruction rule, which is if senators, Republican senators, are refusing to agree to anybody except former US attorneys, former prosecutors, big business lawyers, and are not looking and willing to accept a diversity of professional background, that's a form of obstruction that should really be a part of a no obstruction rule with respect to the blue slips, because we can't continue that notion that the only path to being a federal judge is going through the US Attorney's Office, being a criminal prosecutor, or working for big law.
I mean, do any of the three of you see any reason to keep using any blue slips at this point? If, just to throw that out there, because, just looking at the last 4 years, and it predates, there's always been back and forth on confirming judges and rules and the ways people obstruct. I mean, you can just not nominate someone, and that's one way to obstruct. Just don't nominate anybody and don't recommend anybody. And that's been going on for years. But in terms of blue slips, why not, just to play devil's advocate, why should Democrats keep them around at all, given the way Republicans treated Obama's nominees, and then given the way that Trump and Mitch McConnell treated the Senate rules? Why now take the higher ground instead of saying, okay, you blew those up, we're in charge, finally, let's just do this, and you reaped this, So, Senator, or any three of you, like, why keep any blue slips at this point?
Well, it doesn't.
I'll give one reason. I work for a nonpartisan organization, but I recognize that we have to bolster moderate Republicans. If we're going to have any hope of getting the kind of legislative efforts done that we need, we need to bolster moderate voices in the Republican Party. And so to me, that's a reason to retain blue slips for district court nominees, and that is to support moderate Republican senators.
So there's a super talented African-American woman, the first ever to serve on the First Circuit, who is in the so-called Rhode Island seat. And she's somebody that I energetically recommended in the Obama administration. And if she should choose to retire or go on senior status and a vacancy opened up that had a Rhode Island connection, then I would want to have myself and my senior senator, Jack Reed, have a voice in that, because we know the Rhode Island community better than the Biden administration. And I think the Biden administration, with its own vetting of all of this, can make sure that we're not picking somebody who's unqualified or has problems. And the balance works out quite well. And in the old days, it actually worked out quite well with Republican senators until the whole thing turned political and ideological, and then they blew up the blue slip. So I don't see any reason to punish Democratic senators and take the blue slip away from them for the misbehavior of Republican senators who took the blue slip away from us. So I'd be partisan about it. And I think the similar thing is true on the district courts, except that the Republicans let us keep our blue slip. And I think it's, if they played fair enough with us, we should play fair back with them, up to the point of obstruction. And Tom is right. Obstruction includes insisting on people who are either unqualified or cookie cutter. You got to be able to work together. And I think we're pretty sophisticated folks who've been around a while. Dick Durbin certainly is. And he'll be able to suss out, I think, with pretty good acuity, what's going on. It's kind of a you know it when you see it type phenomenon, and you can tell. And frankly, who the senator is has something to do with your judgment in that regard, because some of them who are a real pain in the neck, are going to have less of a loose leash than others who you have confidence in as to their judgment and integrity.
So we're getting some questions from the audience. So I'm going to throw out the first one. It's for you, Tom. Here's the question. I noticed you were on the Demand Justice shortlist for potential Supreme Court picks, which was a very diverse, impressive list. Do you think there would be more diversity on the federal bench if the process was more transparent?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, as Nan and Senator Whitehouse have noted, there is more interest, more broadly, in the composition of the judiciary, and that needs to be encouraged more and more. And transparency is a part of that. And when there's transparency, I think that we will see a greater diversity of all kinds throughout the court system. I will tell you that one of my goals, and I've said this directly to the Biden transition team when it comes to judicial nominations, is the second most important court in the land, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, has never in its entire history had a Latino or Latina judge. And the thing about the DC Circuit is its importance comes from, I would say, three different attributes. Number one, it's been where many Supreme Court justices have come from, even today. Number two, because of its jurisdiction, it is passing on many of the most important federal policies, administrative and otherwise, under any administration. But third, and this goes to something that the senator alluded to previously with respect to other circuits, but the DC Circuit is recognized as not geographically bound. You can get somebody from California, Alaska, Hawaii, and bring them to the DC Circuit Court of Appeals because it's viewed as a national court. So I've told the Biden folks right up front that one of my goals is for them to break that barrier and put first Latino or Latina judge on the DC Circuit Court of Appeals. And I think that because of hopefully greater transparency and what Nan has described as greater interest, we can build a real groundswell of support for that kind of barrier breaking.
Yeah, the DC Circuit hasn't had blue slips because it hasn't been the seats haven't been associated with states.
So Tom, is this you unofficially announcing your bid to fill Merrick Garland's seat? Just blink, yes.
It's
One-
not going to be. It's not ever going to be me. I learned that lesson. That
Just
being-
wink
being
if
of
that's
your-
happening behind the scenes.
There are fine. There are fine. I can give you, and I gave them examples.
It's an honor just being nominated. I know.
There are fine judges on the East Coast. Wouldn't have to move very far. I mean, I'll say one. There's a New York Court of Appeals judge, Jenny Rivetta, I think is terrific. And if the Biden administration was able to get her off of the New York Court of Appeals into the federal system, I think we'd all be the better for it. But there are others, and I gave them other names as well, who could fill Merrick Garland's seat quite handily.
That's just the right answer for somebody who would like to position themselves for Merrick Garland's seat. Just kidding. Okay, another question from the audience. I think this is for you, Senator Whitehouse. President Biden has nominated Kristen Clark to head the Civil Rights Division at DOJ. Republicans have traditionally targeted the Civil Rights Division nominees for defeat. Some former nominees here were Debo, I remember this, Adigbele and Vanita Gupta, who's never even nominated because she would have been defeated. What are Democrats on the committee doing to head off another rejected nomination for this position?
Well, it's really about Democrats not spooking and holding firm, because we can vote 50-50 on the Judiciary Committee, and the chairman can refer the nominee onto the executive calendar on the floor. And then there's a fairly ordinary process of time on the executive calendar that brings nominees up for a vote. And then you have to make sure that we can generate the 51 votes that we need to confirm. So it's just on our side, a question of discipline and preparedness, and also working where we can to find a Republican or two who might see things our way and support a particular nominee. In some cases, you get a concerted, planned public relations attack, a smear campaign that is run primarily by the one or more of the Koch brothers operations. And we have to be prepared to counter that, but largely so that our members don't spook. If we hold together, and by God, have we seen a demonstration of unity by the Republican caucus. I mean, they had to hold their nose for some of the unqualified stinkers who had unbelievable histories of injudicious prior behavior, but they just cranked right through them. I think Senator Kennedy blew one up when he didn't know what a motion in limine was. And after that, they made them all know what a motion in limine was. And Senator Kennedy got scolded and told not to ask hard questions of these nominees and disrupt the assembly line. And, that was the end of that. But other than that, I mean, they'd vote for anybody that, to say you can indict a ham sandwich, how you could get a ham sandwich appointed to the court through this Senate. So if we are much weaker than they are after they've demonstrably hung together for demonstrably unqualified nominees, shame on us. Plus, we shouldn't allow unqualified nominees into the system in the first place.
So Jen, if I could just interject, because I'm a member of that club. I was offered to head the Civil Rights Division in 2009, and it was taken away by the Obama administration out of fear of how my confirmation would go. New York Times rapped on the knuckles for that a bit. But I would say, I think it was also smart of the Biden administration to put Vanita Gupta up as Associate Attorney General, because when the Civil Rights Division is viewed as a one-off, and that's the only place you're going to have a civil rights-minded lawyer, I think you're putting that nominee in a difficult spot. Going back to Lanny Quinier. But when you're recognizing professional diversity needs to be reflected top to bottom in the Department of Justice, and you put someone like Vanita Gupta, a civil rights lawyer, up to be Associate Attorney General, that will benefit Kristen Clark as well. because it's a recognition that this is mainstreaming of civil rights lawyers and civil rights concerns. And we've seen it in the past. Drew Days headed the Civil Rights Division and then became Solicitor General in a later administration. But I think that's wise when you get that kind of professional diversity top to bottom and civil rights lawyers represented top to bottom.
Only thing I would add is we'd like to see the Democrats act more like Sheldon Whitehouse, develop a backbone. When Debo Adigbele was nominated, the police unions went after him and he was forced to withdraw. And then the message from that was, well, maybe the administration ought to pursue a path of least resistance and pick safer judges. We will be there at every bend and turn of the road to push senators, to work with senators, but also to hold them accountable, to ensure that they are courageous and fight for lawyers who have been in the trenches for years, representing criminal defendants, public interest plaintiffs. We're going to make sure that there is a fight in this committee and the Senate.
Another question from the audience. What is the best way to let the administration know you want to be considered for appointment if you're not someone who would be traditionally on the radar? Is there any indication that the administration will consider people that are not recommended by senators? And this is for anybody, I guess, if you're familiar with this process.
I would say a lot of people are calling us, and we like getting calls from lawyers who are interested in judgeships. So people should feel free to contact us, contact Tom, other organizations, but we are singularly devoted to making sure that some wonderful judges get confirmed. So we're happy to speak to anyone who contacts us, almost anyone.
And particularly when you have states in which there are a considerable number of courts and a considerable number of judges, there's very often an accommodation that's reached between the White House and the senator. You know, we really want so-and-so, I really want so-and-so, and you work out kind of a compromise. And that does allow people to get appointed because the White House wants them and not just because a senator does. And clearly President Biden, as the formal nominee, has a very significant voice in all of this. So, yep. And I think working through organizations that are close to the Biden White House is probably the best way to get your name to the top of that list.
And Jen, I just want to emphasize that the senator said organizations, Nan identified organizations. We are not creating some equivalent of the Federalist Society where it's all insourced to one organization. We want to make sure that there is a plethora of organizations, from small grassroots organizations that understand and recognize the importance of judicial appointments up to the national organizations that are represented here. We want to make sure that we are getting sources of potential judges across the country.
Another audience question. As a plaintiff's employment lawyer, I am concerned about the fact that most federal judges have backgrounds as prosecutors or big firm lawyers representing corporations. They don't understand people who are often employees. As a lawyer who represented people, how can we ensure that President Biden will nominate more judges who have represented people rather than corporations? Anyone?
Well, I was glad to see that White House counsel Dana Remus, in a letter she sent to the Senate, specifically called for the appointment of judges who were demographically diverse, but also judges who are experientially diverse, have represented plaintiffs, employees. So I think at least at the beginning of this, administration is sending out the right message, the right signal about looking for judges who are professionally diverse from all corners of the legal profession, not just corporate lawyers or prosecutors.
So, and I would just add, I think we need to reinforce that message from the outside as often as possible. So just the question is a great one. Got to get that out in the public, because folks always need to be reminded. You know, those of us in the legal profession know, many of us know it's false, but we know that there is this false notion that the best lawyers go and become prosecutors or big law, because why would someone not want to go make tons of money? Believe me, I get that perspective. I get that perspective in my own family as the first lawyer in my family. But the notion that the best lawyers only go to big law or to prosecutors' offices is just false. But it's a notion that's out there in the profession, and we've got to counter that constantly and emphasize the best lawyers have a diversity of professional experience across the board.
Okay, I think this might be our last question from the audience. Is there a push for judges eligible for senior status to take it now, as opposed to waiting until 2022? And maybe if there isn't, should there be? Anyone?
I have to believe that there were some judges who looked around at the pool of Trump nominees and, setting aside their political persuasions, thought, this is a court that I've served for decades. I love this court, and we can do better than this gong show of political clowns. It just doesn't serve the institution that I love and serve to have more of these people in. So I'm not going to create a vacancy. And now I think with President Biden in a position to put a higher quality of candidates forward, you may see judges who felt that way now feel that it's sort of safe for their court for them to retire. I mean, in some respects, it's almost a cruelty to your colleagues to let a really objectionable personality and a really unqualified lawyer onto the court, because everybody else is going to have to cope with all the nuisance and the nonsense that they cause. And everybody else is going to have to carry a bigger caseload because they can't be trusted with big cases because they don't understand them. So, you know, you can take the politics entirely out of it and come to a situation in which judges may very well have been holding back from retiring because they didn't want to have their courts harmed.
Jen, you reported, I think today, about a few district court judges who were taking senior status. There are about 50 now vacancies, and I think by the summer we'll have double that. I think many judges have been hanging on with their last dying breath to their seats, and we're just waiting for a Democrat to be elected president. I think we'll see a lot of vacancies, a lot of opportunity, a lot of enthusiasm, and hopefully a lot of wonderful judges going onto the bench.
And Jen, the last thing I'll add is rather than urging senior judges, because many of them will do it on their own, but urging them to go senior or to retire, I'd prefer to create vacancies, if you will, by expanding the courts, going back to where Senator Whitehouse started. There are judicial emergencies still across the country. And as litigators, we see it. We see the delays, we see the pressures, and we really do need, as a country, to look at expansion. And that, in addition to what Nan and the senator described, will create plenty of vacancies.
And Tom, I presume you'll be making this case after Biden nominates you to the DC circuit.
You know, she's really relentless, isn't she?
Just remembering this now. I'm going to keep this tucked in the back of my head for posterity that we had this exchange.
Having called the Fifth Circuit a cesspool, that's going to stop my
That's not your court. Your
right?
court is DC circuit, my friend. Okay, so I thank you so much for this panel, you guys. We are out of time. Thanks to everybody who joined. Nan, Tom, and Senator Whitehouse, thanks for talking judges and courts. And that's it. Everybody have a good night.
Yeah, thank
Be
you.
with you
Thanks
all,
to
and
the
again,
audience.
thumbs up for Nan's incredible service.
Thank you. And thanks everyone who's joined us tonight. And Senator Whitehouse, Tom, and Jen. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.